Hello, this is Melanie, and I'm back reading the book Race and the City, a compilation of essays that were edited by Henry Louis Taylor Jr. I am now on Chapter 9, which was written by Charles F. Casey-Leininger. The title of this chapter is Making the Second Ghetto in Cincinnati, Avondale, 1925 to 1970. And before I get started, let me apologize. The dog is out next door, so if you hear any barking, I'm terribly sorry. The window is shut, so hopefully the sound will be muffled, but he's a rather anxious, cute little puppy, and so we'll just have to bear with that. The study of Black urban history has emphasized the process that led to the formation of Black ghettos during the World War I era, when thousands of Southern Blacks poured into northern industrial centers. The ghettos that emerged during that period reflected the massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North and from farm to city. Indeed, the rise of the Black ghetto signaled the beginning of a new period in northern urban development and of the Black urban experience. The Second World War triggered another massive outmigration of Southern Blacks, which led to the formation of much larger ghettos in most northern cities. These second ghettos made African Americans an even more important element in the residential and political development of northern urban areas. Central cities became increasingly identified as residential enclaves for Blacks and poor whites, while the suburban ring that surrounded them became characterized as residential havens for more affluent, mostly white populations. The rise of a second Black ghetto then ushered in yet another stage in the development of the northern city and in the development of the Black urban experience. With the exception of Arnold Hirsch's study of Chicago, however, there have been no book-length investigations of the processes that led to the formation of the post-World War II Black ghetto. This is perplexing, since the Black ghetto rebellions of the 1960 of ni- since the Black ghetto rebellions of the 1964 to 1968 period played a central role in the ferment that inspired the emergence of Black urban history and the study of the northern Black urban experience. This chapter is an attempt to understand the making of a portion of the post-World War II inner-city Black ghetto in Cincinnati. That ghetto took shape between 1945 and the early 1960s, a period of changing attitudes toward race and of a transformation in the racial and economic distribution and composition of the city's population. Between 1940 and 1970, Cincinnati's Black population increased from 55,593, or 12% of the total, to 125,070, or 28%, an increase of 226%. During the same period, the white population of the city decreased by 52,671, or 12%, of the 1940 white population. Part of the decrease in the white population of the city was directly attributable to migration from the city to the new suburbs, directly developing outside the city limits. Between 1955 and 1960, a net total of 44,145 white Cincinnatians moved from the city to outlying locations within the city's standard metropolitan statistical area, or the SMSA. though the trend slowed somewhat in the next decade. A net total of 27,445 white city dwellers sought refuge in the suburbs of the metropolitan area between 1965 and 1970. During the same 2 5-year periods, a net total of only 5,309 blacks left the central city, 1,576 between 1955 and 1960, and 3,733 in the 5 years leading up to 1970. Concurrent with the rapid migration of whites out of the central city and the rapid increase in black population, slum clearance and superhighway construction decimated the city's Black West End ghetto between 1940 and 1970. Between 1940 and 1970, the population of the West End and of Mohawk Brighton to the north of it fell from 62,363 to 17,068, and the black population fell from 37,369 to 16,509. The confluence of these and other forces led to the formation of Cincinnati's second black ghetto. This chapter focuses primarily on the Avondale section of that ghetto. Census Tracts 34 and 65 through 69, map 9.1. Cincinnati's first black ghetto, the West End. Cincinnati's first black ghetto took shape during the 1920s in the West End, one of the city's oldest neighborhoods. This area lay to the west and northwest of the Central Business District. During the 1910s through 1940 period, it absorbed most of the city's new black population, thus breaking the old pattern in which blacks lived in relatively small concentrations in enclaves, both in the Old Basin area close to the Ohio River and in the newer hilltop neighborhoods. By 1940, 64% of Cincinnati's black population lived in the West End, an area then 74% black. Though middle-class blacks lived in the West End, the small land area of that neighborhood and the extreme shortage of housing there made it difficult for them to escape the slum conditions that enveloped much of the neighborhood. Thus, the ghetto was racially homogeneous, but heterogeneous with respect to class. Decrepit and deteriorating housing conditions made the West End the object of attack by housing reformers and city planners who first hoped to eliminate it as a residential site, and failing that, to build their new and low-density segregated housing for some of its residents while dispersing the rest to the other segregated locations. As Robert B. Fairbanks points out, see Chapter 7, Cincinnati's planners and house reformers developed segregated housing schemes because they had a certain vision of the nature of neighborhood and community. Prior to World War II, good housing practices required the residential segregation of people with differing backgrounds and social mores. Both blacks and poor whites, the reformers argued, lacked the appropriate skills to function well in an urban setting. If they scattered into better neighborhoods, they would carry blight with them. Until such time that housing reformers and social workers could impart the skills necessary to live in a modern urban community, the most appropriate place for blacks and poor whites to live was planned and supervised housing projects. The incorrigible poor were believed best isolated and left in their decaying neighborhoods, tended to by charity, social workers, the police, and the courts. Following the war, this segregationist vision began to break down, but continued in part to inform the efforts of Cincinnati city planners and some of their allies in housing reform. Escaping the West End. Prior to World War II, the same decrepit and deteriorating housing conditions attacked by the planners and housing reformers bred a desire among many Black West Enders to escape. Some moved into older Black enclaves within the city, especially into the Walnut Hills Black community. Walnut Hills had long contained one of the city's most important Black areas, which at 1925 Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce survey identified as a, quote, higher type of colored settlement, unquote. This community extended into an adjacent small portion of South Avondale. After World War II, the Walnut Hills South Avondale Black community became a nucleus of the second Black ghetto in Cincinnati. In 1940, Avondale was a largely white middle-class neighborhood that contained pockets of poor whites and 3 small Black enclaves. The Avondale section of the Avondale Walnut Hills Black community lay entirely in Census Tract 34 and encompassed the largest Black settlement in Avondale, maps 9.1 and 9.2. Slightly less than half, 46%, of Avondale's Black population lived in Tract 34, which was 20% or 945 Black. 23% of the tract census blocks contain 97% or 243 of its Black households. As in the mid-1920s, this hilltop Black community contained more prosperous citizens and better housing than the West End slum ghetto. 81% of the Black labor force in Tract 34 found employment outside of publicly funded work relief projects, compared to 60% in the West End. 18% owned their own homes, while only 2% did so in the West End. And while nearly 50% of Black housing in Tract 34 needed major repairs or lacked a private bath, 87% of the Blacks in the West End occupied such housing, map 9.1. 2 other Avondale Black enclaves contained another 40% of Avondale's Black households, and in equal proportion. A small enclave occurred just north of the Cincinnati Zoo in Tract 69, map 9.1. Black households along Rockdale Avenue east of Reading Road comprised the 3rd enclave, which provided homes for more prosperous Blacks, doctors, teachers, and Pullman car porters, who in the mid-1920s became the first of their race to live in the area. And that's where my grandfather and grandmother lived, in Avondale. And my grandfather was a Pullman porter, as I had expressed before. I'm wondering about when they moved in there. The house still exists. My brother lives in it now. Just wondering when they moved in. So, Roz, if you're listening to this, you can put a comment. You can put a comment down below and let us know when Nan and Pop moved into the house in Avondale, if you know that or have some idea, okay? And confirming also that Pop was a Pullman porter. I'm pretty sure that's what he was, but if you could put that in the comments, I'd appreciate it, and then that way I'll know if you're listening as I read. That's my sister, Ross. Okay. The beginnings of the second ghetto. The period between 1945 and about 1960 proved critical in the development of the second ghetto. Starting about 1945, blacks faced with extremely low vacancy rates in traditional black areas and with an increasing population, began to move into housing previously occupied by whites in Avondale, tracts 34 and 67, as well as into other traditionally white areas of the city. By 1960, all three of Avondale's pre-war black settlements had expanded so that they now formed one large black area, and whites lived only on the periphery of the neighborhood. Map 9.1 and 9.2. Similar changes in the racial makeup of other contiguous neighborhoods occurred simultaneously. Together, these new black areas formed Cincinnati's second black ghetto. Several factors contributed to the growth of the Avondale portion of this ghetto between World War II and 1970. Pre-war segregation, the failure to eliminate the West End slums and provide adequate housing for its black population, and a large influx of new blacks, 22,600 between 1940 and 1950, played a crucial role in the post-war formation of the city's second ghetto. By 1943, vacancies in black areas dropped to around 1/3 of 1%. This extreme pressure on the housing stock, in combination with new conditions, broke down old patterns of residential segregation and replaced them with new ones. The new factors included white migration to areas away from the central city, increased prosperity among blacks, the easing of racial restrictions on real estate mortgages, and a new willingness by a few real estate agents to sell and rent to blacks in previously all white areas. Among the earliest areas to expand was the Walnut Hills, South Avondale black community. By 1950, it occupied parts of 7 census tracts, 34 through 38 and 67, and had expanded into Evanston. That's where I live right now, a neighborhood to the east of Avondale and north of Walnut Hills. This nascent ghetto contained 12,065 blacks, 40% of the total population of the 7 tracts. Despite its increase in size and population, the percentage of the city's black population in this area remained the same, 15.4%, as in the smaller area encompassed by the 1940 settlement, map 9.1 and 9.2. White migration to the suburban hinterland apparently made the black occupation of these new areas possible. Between 1940 and 1950, the population of Hamilton County outside Cincinnati increased from 166,377 to 219,954. Of that increase, whites made up fully 98%, or 50,270. In the late 1940s, as part of the birth of this new ghetto, the black areas along Rockdale Avenue and in Tract 34 expanded and merged as white residents began to abandon the area. Before 1950, the expansion of the black population in Avondale was limited entirely to Tracts 34 and 67. By 1950, Tracts 34 and 67 contained 2,765 blacks, 26% of the population of those 2 tracts, and 77% of Avondale's black population. Again, referring to maps 9.1 and 9.2. 47% of the census blocks in Tracts 34 and 67 contain 93%, or 756 of their black households. Nevertheless, only 39% of the households in this area were black. By the mid-1950s, however, Blacks lived in a large portion of Avondale from the Forest to Rockdale Avenue corridor southward. While the new ghetto had not reached its fullest extent, its existence had been assured. Census data for 1950 suggested that those in better economic circumstances led the black influx into Avondale. Tract 67, which had a higher percentage of residents of a year's duration or less, 48%, than Tract 34, 17%, also had higher rates for blacks in the categories of employment, professionals, and managers, median income, housing costs, and good housing conditions. Black employment in Tract 67 surpassed that in Tract 34, 93% compared to 84%, and only 9% of Tract 34 blacks worked as professionals or managers, while 14% did so in Tract 67. Median income at about $1,500 in Tract 34 compared to approximately $2,000 in Tract 67 reflected this difference. Renters in Tract 67 paid far more in rent, $43.69 per month, than in Tract 34, $27.17. Housing conditions in Tract 67 also reflected the better circumstances of its black inhabitants. Only 14% of black housing there lacked a private bath or appeared dilapidated, in contrast to Tract 34, where fully 1/3 fell below this good housing standard, map 9.1. Though Tract 34 apparently still served as a haven for blacks in better circumstances than those in the West End, the economic position of blacks in Tract 34 compared to that of West End blacks had slipped since 1940. The percentage of professionals and managers in the rate of home ownership indicated that blacks in Tract 34 still maintained greater economic wealth than those in the West End, where only 4% worked at these jobs and 2% owned their own homes. Perhaps the major difference between the old ghetto and Tract 34 lay in the quality of housing. 74% of the West End lacked a private bath or appeared dilapidated. Despite these positive indicators, other factors indicated a slip in relative economic health. The median income for black families in Tract 34 fell in the middle of the range found in West End tracts, and unemployment equaled that in the older ghetto. Blacks moving into formerly all-white sections of Avondale in the post-war period faced several difficulties. Though some leading institutions eased racial restrictions on mortgage money, many lenders still refused to provide financing to blacks or would only provide it in areas already black. Ads in newspapers often designated the race of those to whom property was available, and the local white real estate board still subscribed to a national code of real estate ethics that effectively placed a prohibition on introducing blacks into white neighborhoods. Those blacks who managed to find homes outside the old ghettos often faced hostility from the remaining whites. And I have an ad from the Cincinnati Enquirer. It was November 1957, and I will put that in, I'll put a link in the comments for you to see that ad where it indicates colored or no restrictions, meaning that blacks could live there. Some of the tension resulted from the activities of unscrupulous real estate agents. Such agents became known as blockbusters for their ability to cause racial change in a neighborhood in a very short time. Blockbusters used a variety of tactics to pressure whites in a targeted area to offer their homes for sale. The panic that resulted from the activities that these agents contributed to changing Avondale from white to black. In several situations where tension developed as neighborhoods underwent racial change, members of the Cincinnati Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee, MFRC, intervened to help calm people's fears, to attempt to stabilize the neighborhood. Nevertheless, black newcomers sometimes required police protection for themselves and their property. Furthermore, the MFRC, Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee, achieved at best only a temporary stability in a few of the areas in which it worked. While it is clear that blockbusting played a part in the rapid racial change in Avondale during this period, it has proven difficult to obtain more than a handful of documentable accounts of blockbusting in the available sources and to establish their unethical real estate brokers played a major role in Avondale's story. And I've got more information for that. As a matter of fact, the next thing that I plan to read is entitled Going Home, and it was published in 2008 by Housing Opportunities Made Equal. And it has documentation talking about blockbusting. So I will share that with you as well. I'm not sure I'm going to share that whole document because I want to read it to you. But at least those pages that verify the blockbusting practices of real estate agents in those communities during that time. Okay. Let me start. I'm going to start back. I'm not sure where I left off. Indeed, real estate agents interviewed for this study who operated in Avondale during this period disagree with each other rather strenuously about this point. I bet they do. You going to tell on me? I'm going to tell on you what? I don't think so. It is worth noting, however, that whatever role real estate agents, unscrupulous or otherwise, played, they could not have turned over, quote unquote, Avondale without a rapidly growing supply of new housing available to whites, a rapid increase in black population, and a general agreement, at least among whites, that countenanced racially segregated neighborhoods. City planning and the second ghetto. At the same time that South Avondale's black population began to mushroom, Cincinnati's city planners, housing reformers, and parts of the business community renewed their attack on the city's housing problems. The Cincinnati Metropolitan Master Plan of 1948, I'll have to look for that, and its supporting studies were central elements in this effort. Though Cincinnati's second ghetto had begun to develop in the late 1940s and early 1950s, before many of the master plan's goals could be implemented, two of its most important goals eventually played critical roles in the consolidation of the new ghetto. One of these goals called for leveling most of the basin's slums and replacing them with lower density private and public housing, and with light industrial and commercial districts in sections separated from the housing. The other goal of the master plan that would affect Avondale was a network of limited access superhighways linking all parts of the metropolitan area. Both the slum clearance program and the highway construction program required clearing a major portion of the West End. Without the successful completion of these two goals, planners, housing reformers, and business interests believed that the city would stagnate and suffer economically. Because both the highway building program and the redevelopment of the basin involved the elimination of thousands of units of housing and the displacement and relocation of huge numbers of people, city officials and housing reformers began to plan in the late 1940s and early 1950s for new housing. They hoped that the multifaceted approach would meet the housing needs of those to be displaced, they hoped. New privately built housing in the suburban hinterland would empty older housing near the basin and make it available to those who could afford to live in private sector housing. Public housing built on vacant land in several parts of the metropolitan area and on a small portion of the cleared land in the basin would house those at the other end of the financial spectrum. Housing that was operated not for profit or for limited profit by organizations interested in housing reform and constructed with the help of government subsidies would serve those in between. The city would enforce zoning and housing codes in order to prevent the spread of decay as the slum dwellers moved into new areas. Execution of these relocation housing plans proved more difficult than their authors had hoped. By 1955, on the eve of construction of the expressway through the West End and the start of the first slum clearance project there, little of the proposed housing had been built. Public pressure by whites who feared blacks living close to them severely limited the ability of the Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, CMHA as we know it today, to build public housing. What little the CMHA could build rapidly filled with blacks, thus creating new segregated neighborhoods. Private plans to provide low-cost subsidized housing largely failed due to high cost. Private builders produced most of the new construction in the metropolitan area in single-family houses at prices well above the means of people living in the basin slums. By the mid-1950s, this new construction helped ease the housing shortage for the white middle class and those whites being displaced from expressway and slum clearance sites, but not enough older housing filtered down to blacks to ease their housing shortage. Trickle down, trickle down. My goodness. In the mid-1950s, contemporaneous with the failure of Cincinnati's relocation housing programs, city officials and housing reformers began to be concerned by the spread of blight into the older hilltop neighborhoods as large numbers of blacks and poor whites poured into houses vacated by the white middle class. Many of these newcomers, strapped for money and desperate for housing, occupied their new apartments and houses at a higher density than the previous residents, leading, at least in the opinion of some, to the deterioration of those neighborhoods. Zoning and housing code enforcement seemed unable to deter decay. Among the several neighborhoods affected, South and Central Avondale attracted particular attention. Planners and reformers noted that they still had a large supply of good housing stock worth preserving. The evidence indicates the planners intended urban renewal efforts in Avondale to preserve private sector housing for blacks displaced from slum clearance sites. Important city officials defended segregated housing and thus presumably favored channeling black relocatees to black or changing neighborhoods. From 1948, when the master plan was issued, through 1959, no Cincinnati city officials concerned with housing other than members of the MFRC stated, for the record, as far as I could determine, that they believed in racial residential integration. On the contrary, in 1959, the head of Cincinnati's Department of Urban Development, the local agency in charge of urban renewal, in a statement to the press, defended placing segregated black relocation housing in Avondale and in other black and changing areas. And in 1961, the chief of the city's housing bureau, in his annual report to the city manager, spelled out how whites might defend their neighborhoods from blacks seeking housing there. I gotta get that document. In addition, by the mid-1950s, the portion of Avondale chosen for rehabilitation, parts of tracts 34, 67, and 69, had attracted a substantial black population. During the next 4 years, slum clearance, as planned, displaced thousands of blacks from the West End. By 1960, when the city issued its renewal plan for Avondale, only the northernmost census tract in Avondale remained below 50% black. Though the renewal plan itself did nothing overt to channel more blacks into Avondale, several subsidized housing projects proposed for Avondale intended to do just that. Plans for these housing projects specifically designated them for people displaced from urban renewal sites. In at least 2 cases, city officials linked them with the need to house West Enders, the majority of whom were black. 3 other proposed relocation housing projects intended for Avondale sites were openly designated for blacks. In addition to conserving Avondale's housing stock, planners and business community also worried about the proximity of the growing ghetto to the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati's major complex of hospitals. To protect these institutions and the potential supply of good used relocation housing in Avondale, city planners began in 1956 to develop an urban renewal plan for an area that encompassed parts of Avondale and of Coreyville, a neighborhood that lay south of Avondale and adjacent to both the university and the hospital. When completed in 1960, the Avondale-Coreyville General Neighborhood Renewal Plan set standards for rehabilitating residential property and planned for urban renewal experts to provide assistance to homeowners trying to meet those standards. In addition, the plan proposed public improvements designed to increase the desirability of the neighborhood as a residential area and intended to encourage private developers to upgrade the 3 main shopping areas. Furthermore, the plan recognized the need of the university and the hospitals to expand into previously residential areas. The consolidation of the ghetto. By 1960, Avondale's population reflected the destruction of the Old West End ghetto, a large increase in black population citywide, and continued white migration to suburban Hamilton County. Cincinnati's black population increased by 30,500 during the 1950s, rising from 15% to 22% of the total at the same time that the city's white population decreased by 23,448. During this same period, the black population in the West End decreased by 15,000. Thus, in 1960, roughly 45,000 more blacks lived in areas in Cincinnati outside the West End than in 1950. At the same time, the suburban population, Hamilton County outside of Cincinnati, increased from 219,954 to 361,550. But of that increase, only 2%, 3,004, was black. Avondale, with 56% of its population now black and home to 18% of the city's blacks, had become part of a new deteriorating black ghetto, map 9.2. Over the decade, black population in the neighborhood increased by over 16,000 individuals, all of it in tracts 34 and 66 through 69. Simultaneously, total population in those tracts increased by 16%, reflecting the greater crowding noted by housing officials over the previous 5 or 6 years. Blacks were not evenly scattered throughout the neighborhood. This growing ghetto encompassed a large contiguous area of Avondale, including the 3 original enclaves. Only 2% of Tract 65 residents were black, while elsewhere in the neighborhood, blacks made up 69% of the population. One half of the census block in tracts 34 and 66 through 69 contained 80% or more black-occupied dwelling units. Another 23% contained greater than 80% white units. The remaining blocks had more mixed population, map 9.1. Census data indicate a slip during the 1950s in housing quality in tracts 34 and 66 through 69, map 9.1. In 1950, these tracts had 1/3 the rate of poor housing of the rest of the city. In 1960, those same tracts had 1/2 the rate of poor housing for all of Cincinnati. But despite the relative drop in housing quality over the decade, Avondale south of Tract 65 still provided a refuge for blacks in better than average economic conditions. Black median income in those tracts ranged from a low of $3,800 to a high of $4,800, compared to $3,250 for blacks citywide. Several other indices of economic health, including the proportion of professionals and managers in the workforce, rates of home ownership, and median value of owner-occupied housing, all indicated that black Avondale, particularly tracts 66, 68, and 69, remained better off than black Cincinnati as a whole. Furthermore, tract 68, which had the highest percentage of newcomer blacks, 66% over the previous 2 years, also had for Avondale blacks the highest rents, value of owner-occupied housing, proportion of professionals and managers, and owner-occupants as a percentage of black-occupied 1 and 2 unit buildings, map 9.1. Apparently then, in the late 1950s, middle-class blacks led the way for the black advance into Avondale. The failure of the Avondale-Corryville renewal plan. Despite the relative economic health of black Avondale and despite years of planning, urban renewal plans for Avondale-Corryville immediately ran into trouble. The housing rehabilitation aspect of the program eventually failed because of the rapidly changing population, the high cost of residential inhabitation, the lack of money and initiative from financially strapped residents within the project area, and intensivity on the part of the staff charged with executing the plan. Insensitivity on the part of the staff charged with executing the plan. Instead, the renewal plan provided a vehicle for the expansion of the hospitals and the university within the renewal area. Little of the federal and city money spent on the project went directly to housing rehabilitation. The city sacrificed more than half of Corryville's housing stock to institutional expansion, and the University of Cincinnati dormitory space accounted for over half the new housing units constructed in the project area by 1970, when the renewal program ended. Indeed, new construction funded by the program provided only 28 units for non-elderly, low-income families and individuals. 28 units. The evolution of a new ideology of race and housing. During the 1950s, a new ideology began to unfold that saw benefits for both individuals and the public at large from residential racial integration. The unfolding of that ideology was closely linked in Cincinnati with its urban renewal efforts. As had Cincinnati city planners before the war, the authors of the master plan of 1948, gotta get it, believed in segregated neighborhoods. Their belief in the appropriateness of segregated communities informed much of the work of the planners through the late 1950s. The failure of relocation housing plans throughout the 1950s, spreading slums in Avondale and elsewhere, escalating racial tension as old black enclaves expanded into formerly white areas, and difficulties with the Avondale-Corryville urban renewal program in the early 1960s led some city officials to link the success of urban renewal with racial residential integration. Before the planners began to re-examine their beliefs, however, some housing reformers began to question the value of residential segregation, and by the mid to late 1950s, they began to work for residential racial integration as a way to provide good housing for the city's blacks and to empty the slum whose housing conditions had so concerned them for most of the century. They've just been worried for a whole 100 years. A whole 100 years. Worried. Concerned. For 100 years. The growing support for racial integration also found expression in neighborhood organizations. In 1959 and 1960, two biracial organizations formed in Avondale in response to chaotic racial change and deteriorating housing. The first formed in early 1959. The Crescent Civic Association, centered around North and South Crescent Avenues in North Central Avondale, attempted but failed to establish the area it claimed to represent. By the early 1960s, blacks occupied much of the Crescent neighborhood, and owners had cut up many formerly single-family homes into apartments and rooming houses. In early 1960, following the failure of the Crescent Avenue Association, another group formed in Avondale to encourage the stable development of an integrated neighborhood in the North Avondale School District, which included most of the Crescent area. While the Crescent Civic Association did not explicitly state its support for racial integration, its biracial character implied that it accepted such a neighborhood. The North Avondale Neighborhood Association, NANA, however, stated its support for residential racial integration from its beginning in its bylaws and other public declarations. NANA did ultimately prove helpful in assisting the transition of its primarily middle-class neighborhood from white to racially mixed in some areas. By the early 1960s, support for residential racial integration reached the highest levels in Cincinnati's Urban Renewal Agency. In late 1960, Charles Stamm, longtime head of Cincinnati's Department of Urban Development, estimated that those blacks displaced by slum clearance could be relocated with relative ease if they could be placed in the existing good housing scattered throughout Cincinnati. By taking this stand, Stamm reversed his early defense of racially segregated housing. As support for integrated housing grew, its advocates proposed several laws and ordinances at both the local and state level to ban real estate sales practices believed to enforce residential racial segregation. The first of these ordinances came before the Cincinnati City Council in early 1962. While substantial support apparently existed on the council for some sort of legislation banning blockbusting, it failed to pass any sort of fair housing legislation during this period. Most members of the council argued that only statewide laws would be effective and that local ordinances might exacerbate the trend toward a black and poor city surrounded by wealthier white suburbs. A state fair housing law did garner considerable support among politicians statewide as early as 1962, but it was not until 1965 that the Ohio General Assembly passed such a statute. The passage of this statute signaled the coalescence among housing activists and some public officials of a new ideology about race and housing that stood in sharp contrast to earlier attitudes. Before World War II, slum dwellers, according to the theorists, caused blight, but by their nature and habits, and thus good housing practices required that neighborhoods be segregated on racial and economic lines to protect the better neighborhoods and to allow housing officials to exercise proper control over the poor and black neighborhoods. After the war, this ideology began to break down. Though it informed the Master Plan of 1948 and a number of other planning and urban renewal schemes, by the mid-1950s, housing activists implicitly separated race from the cause of blight by calling for racial residential integration as a tool in the fight against slums. Racial integration, they believed, might be a way of providing relocation housing to make way for slum clearance. By the mid-1960s, those who propounded the new ideology argued that those who denied individuals the right to live where they chose committed a moral wrong. Furthermore, they contended that blacks and poor whites did not cause slum conditions. Well, duh! It was the owner of the slums. They call them slumlords. And they didn't go after them. They blamed the poor residents living in those conditions, having to pay high rents to the slumlord who wasn't called out. It's like the light came on. Lost my place. Furthermore, they contended that blacks and poor whites did not cause slum conditions. Rather, poverty and racial segregation caused slums. Personal degradation, racial alienation, and continued poverty. And I bet these people were college educated. Thus, it was in the public interest to provide blacks and poor whites with the means and opportunity to escape slums and ghettos and to live in neighborhoods integrated both by race and class. The alternative, racial and economic residential segregation, led to, quote, physical decay of neighborhoods, deepening racial alienation, and pyramiding public expense, end quote. Now, I'm going to share this, and I'm not going to charge you a penny for it. But what if you put poor people in nice housing, integrated, and a shingle comes off the roof and they need a new roof? But they can't get a job, or they just got laid off because they were the last one hired, or they are not paid equal to their white counterparts. So how are they going to fix the roof? Despite a growing agreement by housing activists and some public officials with laws intended to ban racial discrimination in housing, resistance to such laws and to racial residential integration remained powerful forces. Indeed, Cincinnati civil rights activists argued that some members of the city council, while supporting a state law, opposed a local fair housing ordinance because they feared alienating local white voters. Gotta get that vote! In addition, the Ohio Fair Housing Law was relatively weak. The state law exempted owner-occupied 1 and 2 family buildings, which represented the majority of sales. Isn't that convenient? In addition, the law required that only bona fide house seekers could file complaints. Bona fide home seekers could file complaints, which inhibited civil rights groups from helping implement the law. Making matters worse, enforcement rested with a relatively ineffective Ohio Civil Rights Commission, the OCRC. OCRC staff proved inept, if not obstructive, and complainants experienced long delays in having their cases heard. The wheels of justice. The wheels of justice grind slowly. Resistance to fair housing existed in the federal law as well. Proponents of federal fair housing legislation experienced several defeats before they obtained the housing portions of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Indeed, only the emotional outpouring in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination enabled them to persuade Congress to pass such a law. But while that law was somewhat stronger than the Ohio law, Cincinnati civil rights activists still found it difficult to enforce compliance. Fair housing legislation failed to help substantial numbers of blacks leave the ghetto for at least 3 reasons. These included lack of income on the part of many blacks, continued racial antipathy by both blacks and whites, and continued racial housing discrimination. Income was a major problem. The roof. Of 19,065 housing units scheduled for destruction by slum clearance, of 19,065 housing units scheduled for destruction by slum clearance and highway construction by 1966, 2/3 were occupied by non-whites. To make matters worse, at least half the black population could not afford to buy any of the 45,800 new dwelling units built for sale in the metropolitan area between 1950 and 1958. Even for those with adequate income, discrimination confined most black home buyers to areas in which the houses were 40 or more years old. 40 or more years old. And the house that I live in here in Evanston, I believe it was built in 1910. 1910. Old. On the brink of dilapidation, falling apart, old. Roof is going to need fixed, plumbing, electricity, new HVAC, all that. Expenses that come with owning a home. Even for those with adequate income, discrimination confined most black home buyers to areas in which the houses were 40 or more years old. These carried higher down payments, shorter mortgage periods, and higher maintenance requirements that tended to force the monthly shelter costs to levels as high or higher than those for whites in the same income bracket. The rental situation was little better, not much better. The cost of a private portion of the 14,600 new rental units put up in the period also exceeded the means of many blacks. Most of the people who were being displaced by renewal or public works were not even able to afford the proposed 2,200 units of federally subsidized relocation housing assigned to developers by 1960. In addition to overt discriminatory practices that a law might ban as well as financial restrictions, one report on the situation argued attitudes on the part of both blacks and whites would restrict the growth of an open housing market. Thus, the author noted, quote, "There is indeed considerable evidence that a substantial majority of both white and Negro families hesitate to expose themselves to the uncertainties and emotional hazards that accompany any departure from the conventions of governed race relations." That govern race relations. A Negro family must have extraordinary fortitude and courage to risk the cold stares, the slights, rebuffs, and outright insults that may be its reward for shopping for houses outside the accepted area, and maybe a cross in your yard. But even for blacks with adequate income and the fortitude to seek housing in white areas, open housing legislation largely failed. Local civil rights activists documented widespread patterns of discrimination in housing in violation of both state and federal legislation throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. Thus, though some blacks lived outside the densest ghetto by 1970, most remained trapped in largely black areas, map 9.3. 51 census tracts combined contained only 1% of Cincinnati's black population. 36 tracts had populations over 99% white, and another 36 census tracts that were 50% or more black contained 76% of Cincinnati's black population. This latter set of 36 tracts formed 2 large groups and 4 smaller clusters of black populations. The West End Ghetto, tracts 1 through 5 and 8, plus tracts 14 and 15, just to the north still contained a population 97% black, which comprised 15%, or 19,062, of the city's African Americans. The Central Business District and an adjacent neighborhood over the Rhine separated the burgeoning second ghetto from the older one. The newer ghetto encompassed 21 tracts with an African American population of 59,767, 83% of the general population of the area, and 48% of the city's blacks. Two clusters in the Mill Creek Valley, Tract 76, 77, and 86.02, and Tract 80, each held about 5,500 blacks, 79 and 75% black respectively. Two other clusters with about 4,000 African Americans each occurred in Kennedy Heights, Tract 58, 58% black, and Madisonville, Tract 55, 62% black, map 9.3. While the pre-World War II ghetto contained blacks of all classes in close proximity, the second ghetto took on a new form prior to World War II. Public policy and racial antipathy had largely confined blacks in Cincinnati to two relatively small geographic areas, the West End and Walnut Hills, South Avondale. In 1940, these two areas accounted for 80% of Cincinnati's black population. While good housing existed in both of these communities, While good housing existed in both of these communities, their small geographic extent made it difficult for blacks who could afford quality housing to escape close proximity to slum conditions. By 1970, stratification on the basis of income had developed in the now vastly expanded ghetto. Relatively high income allowed some African Americans to move outside the areas of highest black concentration. 9 of the 23 tracts with black median income over $5,000 lay outside those areas greater than 50% black. Only one of these higher income tracts, Tract 82.01, however, occurred at a distance from the post-war ghetto, map 9.4. Though racial residential segregation in Cincinnati is no longer openly sanctioned by official government policy, it is still enforced by real estate practices, economic discrimination, and racial animosity. At best, the new ideology of racial integration has allowed a few blacks with adequate incomes and fortitude to escape the ghetto entirely. Most, however, remain in a new type of ghetto, much larger than the old, and now stratified by income. Now, my parents lived in Evanston, and again, my sister might be able to help me with when they moved to Evanston, but I'm pretty sure that he was able to move there because redlining allowed him to move there with his GI Bill, which would not allow him to, the government wouldn't allow him to move elsewhere. And I think I was born. Roz, you know if I was born. When they moved there. And then I believe it was 1969, 1968 maybe, when my parents moved to Glendale. I remember them looking at Hollydale. They looked at Forest Park. They looked at Lincoln Heights because my mom had a cousin who built a home in Lincoln Heights. And I think that they hired the person that built their home to build the home that they built in Glendale, where my daughter lives now. So we are indeed a part of this migration, the effects of discrimination, the redlining, the blockbusting. But my parents were were blessed. Both my mother and my father worked in order to afford us that opportunity. My mother was anxious to move us into a better school system. So they wanted, I think, the Princeton school system, which is where I graduated from in 71. I graduated from Princeton High School in 71 and was able to move on to college from there. So we were not among those. As I said, my grandfather and grandmother, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, moved to Avondale when it opened up. He was a Pullman porter. He had the income. My grandmother only had my mother. She was an only child. They had no other children to care for. So they had the money to be able to do that. And then my mother went to college for 1 year, so she was fairly well educated. She was able to get nice employment, not the best, but nice. And I think that was attributed to her light skin complexion. I remember her telling me that, other dark-skinned people would not be able to get the jobs that she got. So that was discriminatory. But it enabled her to have the finances, the money, along with the money that my father made, to be able to buy a home, to be able to move from there, use the equity there, and build a home in Glendale. But as we can see from this book here, in this chapter in particular, everybody did not have that advantage. That's why so many of the poor had to move in one with the other, because they couldn't afford the high rents on their own. And they couldn't afford the housing to buy a home. So, needless to say, as I have said before, and I will say it again here, Cincinnati, it is time to make us whole.